Welcome to the second session of the day entitled Religion, Democracy, and State Agendas. My name is Peter Mandaville from the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University, and I have the unenviable task of trying to follow in Ibrahim Musa's footsteps as the chair of this second panel this morning. So one of the recurring themes running through the symposium as a whole is the idea that religion is never simply an external social force operating alongside politics, but rather something deeply entangled with the ways that states seek legitimacy, exercise power, and negotiate relationships with society. This panel brings us very directly into that terrain. The presentations we'll hear today approach these questions from very different empirical geographical vantage points, but collectively they ask a set of shared and timely questions. How do democratic and non-democratic political actors engage religious communities in pursuit of political goals? Under what conditions does religion reinforce democratic pluralism? And when does it become instrumentalized in ways that constrain it? And how do religious actors themselves navigate, resist, or reshape the agendas states seek to impose upon them? Taken together, I think the presentations remind us that the relationship between religion and politics is not simply about belief entering public life, but about ongoing struggles over authority, legitimacy, and the boundaries of political order itself. We're very fortunate this morning to have with us four excellent speakers. Dina, Osama, Lotfy from Cairo University, with a response from Joel Day of the University of Notre Dame. Then we'll hear from Andrew Dickson from the University of Sussex, with a response from Jerry Powers from Notre Dame. In terms of format, we'll essentially do a carbon copy of what was done during the first panel. Each of our four authors will begin with brief 5-minute presentations, after which we'll then have approximately 10 minutes of commentary and response from the designated discussant. Meaning that for the first part of the session, we'll hear each scholar both presenting and then getting the response. And then we'll spend about 30 minutes in collective conversation amongst the five of us here at the table before opening things up for what I will hope be a lively discussion with all of you for the better part of the final hour of the session today. So with that, I think we can go ahead and get started, and I will turn the floor over first to Andrew. Oh, I'm sorry. Dina.
Hello everyone, I'm Dina Lotfy, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Cairo University and also a Global Fellow at the Ansari Institute. So my topic, as you can see, religiously friendly autocratization strategies and responses. And I'm sorry for using slides here, but as a quantitative scholar, I have to put some points to be clear. As you can see, I will just directly define what a religiously friendly autocratization is. It is a process through which political leaders and ruling elites strategically instrumentalize religion to consolidate power, legitimize electoral governance, and neutralize potential sources of opposition. So this is done through different indicators. So I'm putting state religion regulation through material benefits, policy concessions, this kind of cooperative measures, and also about the language and the text that actually readers use in their own speeches, as well as also the religious freedom, which is the freedom to practice religion, freedom of religion conversion as well. So these are like different measurements or different indicators that actually religiously friendly autocratization is used as an umbrella of these different indicators. So it is a combination of these three different things. But not all autocratizers experience the same duration trajectory of the autocratization process, and I mean by autocratizers those who are emerging autocrats, those who are new autocrats, and autocratization and the transitions towards autocracy as well. So this kind of contextual differences shape why a would-be autocrat adopts a cooperative or unfriendly stance toward religious actors. So here my own book is talking about different strategies, very highly religiously friendly, mostly religiously friendly, moderately religiously friendly, barely religiously friendly, or not at all. So there are different degrees of religiously friendly autocratization here. So there are two main questions the book actually is trying to answer. The first one is about how do the autocrats navigate the relationship with religious actors as they consolidate power. The second question is about whether autocratizer engineered religious environments successfully shape religious institutional behavior in ways that serve regime interests. So here we are testing the strategies of autocratizer, whether it actually succeeded or failed. So here, as you can see, there is three scholars that I'm actually trying to situate my own book with them. First of all, Scott Appelbaum, not because he is our boss here, but his argument about religious ambiguity is very important in formulating the concept of religiously friendly autocratization. And I'm also here in dialogue with Michael Dreesen's, not because he's also here, but religiously friendly democratization. And here my own concept actually got inspired by religiously friendly democratization's concept of Michael Dreesen. But what I'm adding here is that the same policies that actually Dreesen talked about regarding religiously friendly policies like religion inclusion, which actually deepens democracy, these same policies are also deepening autocracy. So, and here I'm also taking somewhat Huntington also waves and reverse waves to discuss this kind of trifecta of religiously friendly autocratization, the book's argument. So how this is done is that the policies that actually Dreesen talked about in the forward democratization wave can be weaponized by political leaders in the reverse wave. So here Appel's by ambiguity explains why Dreesen's tools can be weaponized, and Huntington's cycles show when and how these reversals unfold. So the first part of the book is about the autocratizer's strategy. So I'm here talking from the autocratizer perspective. So in this chapter, it develops a theoretical framework and empirical evidence explaining when and why autocratizers adopt religion-friendly policies and under what condition this gives way to repression. So there are two main arguments here. One, the first one to answer this question or to this research puzzle is that duration of the autocratization process. So we have different time period when autocratization happened. So the duration of the autocratization process is one of these. And the other argument here is about institutional characteristics of religious actors. So I'm here using quantitative methods, using 127 autocratizers during episodes of autocratization from 1990 until 2024. So this book develops a theory of autocratizer religion interaction. I argue that religion-friendly policies prevail in the early stages of autocratization, when legitimacy needs are high and coercive capacity is limited, but tend to give way to repression at the process prolongs. So here is a spectrum of early, mid, and late stage of autocratization, and this is how the policies actually are different from one time to another. So the same autocratizer can appear both religion-friendly and religion-unfriendly at different points in time. And you can see the case of Nicaragua, you can see the case of Turkey, and there are many cases that actually show to you how these kind of different trajectories happen in the same time. So also the other argument here is about the institutional characteristic, and here, as you can see, the would-be autocrat is a new actor, but religious institution existed centuries or decades before, so he is dealing with the organizational structure of the religious institutions and how this affects his own strategy to be friendly or not friendly, but I'm not going to get into the details about this argument right now. So the second part of the book is about the results. And as you can see, religious friendliness as an autocratizer strategy backfires. It retains the institutional capacity of potential opposition rather than silencing it. So the religiously friendly policies of the authorizer actually fails in its own goal to neutralize the opposition of religious institutions. The successful thing is when the authorizer adopts more restrictive religious strategies, and this is mainly happened in the long protocolization period of time. And moderate approaches actually provide unpredictable religious institutional responses. And in this argument, I relied on 133 autocratization cases in the post-third wave period. So this is actually like summarize my own ideas of the book, but we can focus on the last column, which is the strategic effectiveness of the religiously friendly autocratization. So in the short period of time, it is partially effective. In the moderate time, it is the least effective because opposition here peaks among strongly in institutions. But in the long autocratization, it is the most effective time when the autocratizer can succeed in repressing religious institutions. However, I found in my own results that there is the residual opposition that still, even though it is 30 to 40% probability to oppose autocratizers at the long duration period of time in autocratizers. So we need to take into consideration that this might happen as well, and but still the autocratizer succeeds in his own strategy at the long autocratization period of time. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Dina. We'll turn over now to Joel for his response.
It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I'm so excited to talk a little bit about Lotfy's work. We've been talking for the last 9 months or so, and I want to share with you a few of my reflections on what I think is an ambitious fusion of empirics and novel theory that brings together multiple streams of scholarship, like was mentioned in the graphic there, into a really clever synthesis to explain the relationship between autocratizing leaders and their relationship with religion and religious leaders and organizations. The project theorizes a state-religion relations during democratic backsliding as what is essentially a two-sided strategic interaction, conditioned by time over the duration of a regime. Right? So the success-failure is conditioned on state capacity as it grows over time. The project coins the RFA, religiously friendly autocratization, by inverting Michael's religiously friendly democratization, speaking to his work. And RFA shows the same mechanisms that produce democratic outcomes in Michael's account can also contribute to backsliding, and the policy instruments are thus balanced, right? They go both directions, not destined to support democracy. So the key variable introduced by Dr. Lotfy is time of the autocratizing episode, where the deeper the state capacity is over time, the more autocratic regime is likely to repress the religion that it once seduced with money, prestige, and power. So I learned in reading some of the drafts that autocratizers may indeed be the ambivalent ones, where the choice of friendliness or repression is about what they can get at a given time and what their capacity is at a given moment in their regime. Lotfy also shows that the religious leaders and organizational resistance are built upon what is termed as endowments, like transnational embeddedness of, say, the Catholic Church, which is the strongest predictor of opposition, by the way. Historical pro-democracy legacy, which is a path-dependent resource, but also centralization, market monopoly position relative to other religions, government appointment authority over the clergy. These endowments set religious groups on a path towards more or less acquiescence to regime pressure. Lotfy's argument is thus in direct conversation with touchstone works on the interaction between democracy and religion. First, Lotfy complements existing work by Bus to show that autocracy and democracy trajectories are context-dependent and conditioned by a series of sequences. As Bus shows, prior relations between church and state set into motion the relationships that either contribute to various regime outcomes. And Dr. Lotfy extends the framework by adding some important elements. One, the tools that autocrats use to lure religious groups into alliances. And two, the timing of autocratic rule where leadership is consolidated, regime leadership, that is. So, while Grzmolabuse and Lotfy agree that historical trajectories structure democratic outcomes, what's unique about this work is the other side of the coin, which is uniquely Dina's contribution. Religious groups and autocrats have agency and use it to further their objectives, but church-state relationships are structured, not just agency, but structured, with top-down choices by elites and by the institutions and regimes, and that matters for the outcomes that we're considering today. So the core idea of religious engagement as phased and capacity contingent, influencing the strategy of would-be autocrats, is essential for understanding where religion sits in the broader democratic backsliding literature, works by Ziblatt and Bormio and others. This is in addition to the framework that synthesizes transnational ties and democratic legacy, centralization, market position, etc., that I previously mentioned. These are the causal mechanisms. And I think this is the most interesting part of what Dina has presented to us today. That there are specific causal mechanisms in the church-state relationship, and this is what really advances the field. Lotfy here moves us from analyzing the actions of autocrats to religions and focuses us instead on the strategic interactions between religion and autocracy and the outcomes of that interaction. This dyadic, co-constitutive lens is new to both religion and democracy fields, which have developed in parallel and often take each other as stable, when in fact they are intertwined in complicated ways. So in both methods and theory, Lotfy's phased model provides a rich explanatory framework under what conditions we should expect regimes to seduce religion. This adds rich structural layers to literature on religious ambivalence, which tends to be focused on agency. It is not simply that religious groups are ambivalent to autocratizing, but the autocratizer pursues campaigns of seduction at the start of a regime that then influence agent choice. Leaders with autocratic tensions are, as St. Peter wrote in this very city, prowling around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. They are in search of legitimacy, and that religion supplies that legitimacy. They offer real and tangible benefits to that religion for a short-run exchange. Finally, until now, we have had very little evidence for the internal mechanisms for when autocratic co-option becomes full-on repression. Lotfy smartly separates the coercive capacity of the state of the autocrat, which deepens over time, from the legitimacy that they need early in an autocratic episode. So prior work by my colleague, our colleague Carrie Castle, has conceptualized these as co-occurring, simultaneous, but Lotfy argues, empirically, these are phased. So I'm excited that the direction that this book points the field in the future. For example, in the quantitative methods, Lotfy's work can be extended in the future by a different scholar. It's not something we're going to add to your book right now. For formal modeling of moderated mediation between the endowments that cause responses, both directly and indirectly, with duration modeling and the paths that suggests. Formal interaction effects would be extremely interesting. Unfortunately, this is not something, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that Dina's able to do because there's only 9 long-duration cases, as suggested in the data set, which makes the statistical testing highly problematic for empirical methods. Due to these limitations, it is even more crucial that we recognize, and she didn't really talk about this very much, but the back end of the book are qualitative case study chapters to explore in depth the interaction effects between regimes and religions at the high, medium, and low levels of religious friendliness. The qualitative material reinforces the statistical story The illustrative cases already woven through early chapters, with these later chapters forthcoming, reinforce the value of the theory. Turkey is the clearest demonstration of the temporal logic. Erdogan and the AKP begins with friendliness, expanding the Diyanet, multiplying Imam Habib schools, and elevating Islam as a national identity, only then to turn on previous allies, Gulen movement being the great example. The same strategic arc influences Nicaragua. I believe that Dina already spoke about that, so I'll talk about it. These cases also illustrate the endowment logic of the religious response side. The Russian Orthodox Church, highly centralized, nationally concentrated, and effectively captured through state-aligned leadership, supplies legitimacy and provides few mechanisms to push back against Putin. By contrast, the transnationally embedded Catholic Church in Nicaragua and the Philippines, where Duterte courted some clergy while attacking those who condemned his drug war, retains the external visibility and moral standing to resist later on. Together, these cases show how high, medium, and low levels of friendliness, how timing and endowment, they jointly produce divergent outcomes for religion and autocracy. But while these various chapters remain under construction, finalizing case selection and matching cases and endowment levels is essential to carrying the weight of the small n quantitative results that they can't, but they point in the direction of your findings. Finally, in my last 20 seconds, and in the spirit of our lecture last night, policy and practical implementation is not to be undersold. Religious communities should be aware. Early religion-friendly gestures by a regime signal incomplete consolidation more than belief in the cause. Furthermore, because leverage exists early and collapses as coercive capacity deepens, the policy implication is that international actors, donors, democratic allies must act in the early friendly stage, the friendly phase, to balance against the regime before it's too late. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joel. And we will now hand over to Andrew for 5 minutes on his work.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to Jerry and to everybody at the Ansari Institute for all of their support over the last year, as well as to bring us all to Rome. And as we're here, I'll begin with quoting a British diplomat who was posted to the Holy See. The purpose of establishing a mission to the Holy See was purely political. The work carried on had nothing directly to do with the Catholic religion. Our relations were with the Vatican as an institution. Our diplomat stressed the Holy See's global reach, its tenaciously held principles, its influence over Catholics across the world, and its international core of teachers, nurses, doctors, scientists. Religion here is translated into the language of non-state actors, political ideologies, state services, a framework that fits with what the Foreign Office already does. Ideological clashes can be elided. Diplomats should collaborate with an effective global network when interests overlap. Now, that wasn't actually one of my interviewees. It was a diplomat called Alec Randall writing in 1959. But his rationales are, I think, strikingly contemporary, demonstrating that religious engagement isn't entirely novel, but crucially shaped by historical continuities. My manuscript explores how a transnational policy argument has travelled to British foreign policy. The terms will be familiar. Given religion's global significance, diplomats need religious literacy, should work with religious actors, and must protect religious freedom. I analysed 3 cases: countering violent extremism, the UK Holy See relationship, and freedom of religion or belief advocacy. I argue that religion has been reintegrated into British foreign policy primarily through translations, practices that create meaning across the fluid epistemic boundaries between religious traditions and the secular. Translations here construct how religion relates to policy problems, or to the social, political, and cultural more generally. And because Britain lacks strong institutional barriers to keep religion out of policymaking and has not built significant new capacity for religion-attended diplomacy, these translations have been front and centre. religious engagement advocates in the UK focus on convincing other diplomats that religion matters, and not only as a violent force. While there are here examples of very sophisticated translations by British diplomats, the most common translation, or incomplete coast perhaps, is religion as omnipresent, locally rooted, socially political, influential non-state actors to engage through standard diplomatic practices. Rather than desecularising, such translating by policymakers also reinforces aspects of what Stacey Kukowski has termed Britain's secular habitus. Religion is brought into policymaking, but made to cohere with state neutrality by fitting into supposedly universal policy frameworks. Islamist extremism becomes a political ideology, legitimising state-sponsored ideological interventions. An Anglican bishop can scrutinise the SCDO's support for persecuted Christians as a neutral broker. The state empowers or intervenes within religious traditions in ways presented as religiously non-partisan. These dynamics are not new. Through critical historicisation, I show that Britain's religious secular order has long provided roles for religion in public policy. Church establishment grants the Church of England privileges, but also guarantees a public presence for other religious traditions. Britain's faith sector also encourages religious public service provision alongside interfaith and social cohesion. The same controversies straddle domestic and foreign policy. The politics of representation, instrumentalisation of religious communities, or whatever word we'd rather use there, and what translations miss out. I argue, therefore, that religion has been reintegrated into British foreign policy where translations of religion align with Britain's existing practices, norms, and arrangements. Narratives that centre Christian persecution, for example, find few takers within the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Erin Wilson reminded us yesterday that the way policymakers interpret religion is crucial. Conceptualising these interpretations as translation highlights what is a selective, relational and political process. As translation theory demonstrates, the translator is a betrayer, reshaping relationships and power relations, but with something always lost in translation. So, as scholars, we should not look for a single or correct interpretation of religion within policymaking. We should instead ask which of many possible translations are adopted and what those translations achieve. Scholar practitioners might also ask another important question, as Jerry has asked me and Mahan has asked me as well over the course of this year. What is a good translation, and how could we do the translation better? Do we want something that's clear and useful for the new audience, which could be making religion fit into the language of policy goals? Do we want actually to preserve strangeness? Do we want to expand languages and challenge existing foreign policy agendas? Or should we focus less on the interpretations and more on the process, building strong relationships and power-attentive, inclusive translation practices? Perhaps we can have all three, but a nuanced understanding of translation surfaces the choices we make and the potential trade-offs and silences that are involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Absolutely heard in so much of what you said, many of the issues that we often wrestle with in the State Department when trying to figure out how to render religious organizations, faith-based actors legible to policymakers. I want to invite Jerry now to offer about 10 minutes of response.
Thank you. As someone who has long thought that most of the world's problems can be traced to the British Empire, it is clear that Scott Appleby has a sense of humor in asking me to evaluate a book on British foreign policy. I think I was invited to do this in part because I served on U.S. State Department working groups on religion and foreign policy in 1998, 2010, and 2012, when I worked for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops on foreign policy from 1987 to 2004. Andrew rightly does not attempt to map and analyze all forms of British government's engagement with religion around the world. Instead of going broad, he goes deep and focusing on three very different ways, and the very different is particularly helpful, in which the British government engages, British foreign policy engages religion. Since the war on terror is well-trod territory, let me focus on the other two. Religious freedom is a controverted issue, but I wonder if the debate is more about foreign policy priorities and less about translation. Why do I say that? First, Andrew points out that it took advocacy in Parliament by mostly conservative cultural, he calls them cultural Christians, I would say conservative Christians, to convince diplomats to shift their focus from how religious freedom could undermine British foreign policy priorities to how religious freedom, how they could relieve domestic political pressure around the religious freedom issue. That move is less about translation than about managing priorities. For example, trade interests versus human rights, pursuing the government's foreign policy priorities versus adjusting those priorities to respond to domestic political realities and legislators. Second, as was the case with the debate over the International Religious Freedom Act in the United States, which I was very involved on behalf of the U.S. bishops, religious freedom legislation was dead on arrival until the focus shifted from persecution of Christians, primarily, to religious freedom for all. And that's because the religious freedom for all fit nicely, as we heard last night from one of our British colleagues, it fits nicely into the wider human rights agenda that the British and other Western governments at least are used to addressing. So isn't that mostly then an issue of not giving Christian religious freedom undue priority rather than a problem of translation? Unfortunately, those who support engagement with religion tend to occupy two distinct camps. One camp focuses exclusively on religious freedom, and the other camp focuses on the wider role of religion in peace, development, and other social justice issues. The two must come together. Clearly, religious freedom is a precondition for faith-based social welfare and social justice work. But religious freedom can be misused in ways that contribute to conflict and injustice, as we all know. And government prioritization of religious freedom can be similarly misused, as the Trump administration has done, by intervening militarily in Nigeria in the name of stopping the persecution of Christians by Muslim extremists, even against the wishes of many Christians in Nigeria. Moreover, if the focus is only on religious freedom, governments miss the opportunity to engage religion in support of human rights, sustainable development, peace, reconciliation, and other good things. A word about the UK Holy See engagement. That's an interesting case, given Britain's particularly fraught history with the Holy See. The Swiss Guard has never been at risk of being replaced by the King's Guard. But beyond that, it is a sui generis case that, as Andrews points out, requires a unique form of translation. He finds that British diplomats understand the Holy See as a leader of a formidable and uniquely effective hybrid network of global and local institutions that hold significant soft power as a norm entrepreneur. Now, particularly interesting and perhaps counterintuitively, he points out that British diplomats also consider the diplomatic relationship with the Holy See as an avenue for broad, multi-religious engagement. So much so that the official purview of the British Embassy to the Holy See now includes the role of religion in world affairs writ large. And that's an important finding because it shows that single identity engagement with particular religious actors does not necessarily undermine, but can actually facilitate the broader interreligious engagement that governments have to be involved in. In general, I found Andrew's assessment of the way British diplomats translate the unique relationship with the Holy See to be an example of how diplomats can engage religion in effective and appropriate ways. Finally, Andrew's study leads him to conclude, as he just said, that the kind of translation that he has made, that has made sense to British diplomats for decades, is to translate religious social action into the secular categories and norms of British foreign policy. They typically, and I'm quoting from the draft, translate religion into a network of influential socio-political actors so that religion barely needs mentioning. That fits well with how many governments view the issue. The obvious problem with this approach is that while they might have many similarities, religious actors are not just like other NGOs or civil society actors. They have their distinct motivation, assets, and ways of engaging that don't fit neatly into standard socio-economic political categories. And this begs a larger question. Is the challenge of religious engagement to find the correct way to translate religion into the secular categories of governments? Or is it more about governments expanding their understanding of their role and rethinking their priorities? Is the challenge to translate religious and moral concepts into terms that make sense to governments, or is it for governments to be more inclusive, bringing religion, religious actors, and morality into the public policy debates because they are important actors and factors in global affairs that can broaden and enrich the policy debate? So while I define the problem as developing a more inclusive understanding of the proper role of the foreign ministry and governments in general, Andrew's more nuanced approach, which he finished with, to translation, might serve the same ends. He suggests, and here I'm again quoting from a longer piece he did last week. He suggests, quote, that maybe we should not focus on the content of the translation, which will always be partial and selective, but the underlying process and relationships that the translations establish. And he calls for a post-secular vision which builds strong relationships with a wide range of religious partners and an open-ended dialogical process characterized by mutuality. That seems to be the kind of translation that is needed. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Jerry. And because you didn't use your full 10 minutes, we're now nicely back on schedule. So we'll transition into the portion of the segment of the panel, rather, where we mix things up a bit on the table. And I wanted to start by asking Dina, in her work, how she thinks about the nature of the relationship between the state and religious structures and religious institutions as an intervening variable that has an impact on the causal mechanisms that you're exploring. You know, obviously you're looking across a wide range of cases, and there will be country contexts where religious institutions are something more approaching truly independent civil society in nature, and then there are other cases where, you know, beyond just the question of the state being enrolled in the appointment of religious leaders, the religious institutions themselves have a more organic relationship to the state. And so I'm wondering how the nature of that state and religion relationship shapes the outcomes on the causal mechanisms that you're looking at.
In the second part of the first argument about the autocratizer strategies, this is what I'm focusing on, about the religious organizational structure, whether it is centralized, decentralized, appointed, the leaders are appointed by the government or not, even also their own historical democratic role, even if there are transnational ties. So the results that what I found is that autocratizers are more religiously friendly towards those who have strong historical pro-democratic role, those who have transnational ties, because these are the problem. You know, so that's why the regime is trying to be very friendly towards them. But at the end of when we see the religious institutional responses, we see that this is actually this backfires. Well, this institution got more privileges, got more capacity to oppose the regime, the autocratizing regime. So yes, all of these characteristics that you have mentioned are tested and controlled, and these were the main highlights of the results, that autocratizers are very friendly towards such type of organizational structure. Also, the regime is friendly towards centralized institutions with a high religious monopoly, more than those who are centralized institutions, but they are facing religious competition. Also, this is one of the main results of of the organizational structure and how the autocratizers are dealing with these differences among the differences.
Great, thank you very much. And Andrew, I wanted to ask you something about this question of preserving the strangeness of religion, and how one thinks about that when it comes to efforts on the part of policymakers to be able to consider engagement and partnership with religious actors. In my many years of struggling with these questions, kind of on the front lines of places like the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Agency for International Development, for me, the easiest shortcut was always to find ways to translate the functional relevance of religious actors into idioms that are immediately legible to policymakers and the standardized policy frameworks that they have. And it's been a subject of a long-running friendly argument that I've been having with Chris Seipel, who's known to many of you in this room. Chris wants diplomats to start by considering their own secular biases and the ways in which that constrains their ability to engage in the strangeness of religion. And my response to that has always been like, look, Chris, if you ask diplomats to start by examining their soul, there's no way they're going to ever engage with religious actors. That's just a non-starter. And yet at the same time, I see the damage and danger that resides in simply collapsing and reducing religion to the sameness of existing policy frameworks. And so I'm wondering, when you think about trying to sort of offer a different model for thinking about how we would do this, and of course I guess that's very directly with many of the themes that Erin was getting at yesterday and that her book engages with, I'm wondering, I'd like to invite you to kind of talk a little bit about how one might get past that seeming impasse between the temptation to collapse and translate religion into policy sameness, and in so doing, to lose the strangeness in which the distinctive qualities of religion actually lie.
Yeah, great question, Peter. And part of the reason for proposing this kind of translation, kind of conceptual model is to say, well, actually getting past that impasse is pretty hard, and maybe we don't, right? And maybe we do just accept the way that you found kind of easier to convince people that you're working with within the State Department or elsewhere that religion is really important to the work that they're doing. That's a very different activity, as you say, from something that's encouraging people to examine their souls, and those are going to achieve different things. So the narrative that I talk about in the British context is part of the reason that it's been kind of pushing at an open door, because there's not been a huge amount of resistance that I've seen explicitly to the idea that if you frame religion in that kind of way, that this is something that we should be working with, and a lot of people would say to me in interviews, all of this stuff about we don't do God, you don't get that anymore in the Foreign Office, and you used to have people saying, we don't see how this fits with what we're doing. So in some ways that achieves something, but it achieves something very, very different from something that doesn't just focus on the functional relevance and says, well, no, we want you to do a little bit of work. And an example of this might be, I was talking to somebody who is an Anglican bishop involved in work that's been happening here on inclusive citizenship, and he was saying, and this kind of touches on Jerry's point as well, which I'll get to in a second in a bit more detail, but he was saying, I look at freedom of religion or belief, for instance, and I absolutely don't see that as something that I support because of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. I support it because of the complete and inviolable human dignity of every individual before God. But I recognise that historically as being something that's contributed to how we understand that human rights framework. But I also recognise that, I meet lots of Muslim interlocutors, and they don't feel the same way. They see this idea of religious freedom as a colonial imposition that's focused on, Protestant conceptions of belief, language that'll be, arguments that'll be very familiar to all of us. And I get that, said this interviewee. So let's explore some different concepts. Let's look at things like citizenship as a way to maybe get to a fairly similar place in terms of multi-religious recognition, acceptance of pluralism in a really positive way, which means that I, as an Anglican bishop, need to do some work. Policymakers need to do some work and think about the language and the categorizing approaches that they take. It also means that these Muslim scholars and interlocutors, they need to do some work as well, but it might get us somewhere quite interesting. I think all of that work is also at a very early stage, and in a way I don't want to provide a model because, as Jerry said, I think a lot of this for me is about saying, well, we should be focusing on the process and who is included and how we're doing that in power-attentive ways, which means that I also don't want to define what that process should look like, because I think part and parcel of defining that is a really important way of ensuring that religious communities, religious organisations don't feel that something is being missed that's really important to them, and that we're not seeing epistemic violence or concepts put forward that they just find completely unworkable on the ground or in their contexts. Let me get to some of Jerry's points, which I'm very, very grateful for, and I think I also want to switch my position a little bit here, not just to stress that I came into the country on an Irish passport, so don't hold all of the British Empire against me, only part of my legacy. But a lot of this book is not so much about this normative side and sort of saying what I think the British government should be doing differently. It is making sense of what's happened, and translation is partly a way of understanding how that's taken place. So, to take the kind of the freedom of original belief example, on the kind of the cultural Christian point, I would agree with you that a lot of these politicians I would see as conservative Christians too. I think the point is that in putting forward particular narratives of Christian persecution being an underserved part of the UK's foreign policy, that they're not really kind of taking seriously within freedom of religion or belief protection. Part of those arguments also involve saying, look, the UK government should have a particular concern for Christianity, and it shouldn't be embarrassed about that because of its historical legacy, because of the way that Christianity contributes to Britain's public sphere, a sense of ethics and social cohesion and so on. A language that I do kind of frame within that context of cultural Christianity. So it's a particular way, again, of legitimising that view by trying to frame it in a kind of a universal framework. So maybe one we wouldn't be comfortable calling secular, but which is national. And for that reason, again, something that's sort of taken as religiously neutral and kind of non-partisan. So similarly, I would completely agree with the idea that the universalist approach to freedom of religion or belief for all is what should be taking place. I don't really have a problem with the a universalist human rights framework as a way of doing that, but I think we should be exploring how you translate that to different contexts. I think here it's not so much about a problem of translation, but a way of understanding these debates. And I think this ties into your point about interest as well, which I agree is central. I'm also thinking here about the work that people like Brian Grimm have done, and a lot of the writing on religious freedom that said, well, this also has a kind of a practical application. So trying to break down that binary and saying, no, it is also about interest. It's about freedom and economic development and democracy, and finding a way to kind of make that cohere with US foreign policy priorities. I think I'll stop there for now, but yeah.
Okay, great. Dina, I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to respond to some of the points that Joel raised.
So I think one of the points about the modeling, to put them in one model, maybe another scholar who is good in putting both of them together in one model this would be great. And still, I'm working within my own capacity and with the available data sets. That might say like this project just opened mind for other scholars to work more on such a topic and to provide more evidence for whether this is true or not. So some part of actually these results are suggestive, okay, and some are confirmed. And also I would like to add that I'm also adding religious minorities here in my own discussion as well. Maybe I'm still working on this project to focus more on religious minority and autocratization and how they are interacting with autocratizers as well. But I also would like to thank Joel very much for his own comments. Actually, this project was something and it turned out to be something else. Because this is not, I'm not copying from my own dissertation, it is an extension to my own dissertation, so I was starting from scratch. But Joe's comments, and of course Scott, Dreesen, and Alex, and also my colleagues' comments really developed this project, and they know the first version, how it was, and this version and how it becomes. So I would like to thank Joe for his own comments on the project.
Sheikh Appleby, what time do we need to wrap up, just so? About 1 hour, okay, great. I think what I'd like to do now is to invite either Joel or Jerry to respond to anything they heard in the responses to their initial responses, as well as the additional issues and questions that have come onto the table.
Can I ask Andrew a question?
Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. Okay, two things then. To Dina, I think I know the answer to this, but I want you to share with everyone some of your, as a good comparative scholar, case selection criteria is really important. How did you select your cases for the second part of your book, and what are those cases, just to get everyone's interests? And then Andrew, this is super fascinating. Would you like me to ask you a question about CBE or about, no, I'm not going to, maybe later. I'm actually going to ask this other one. So a few years ago, there was what we would call in international relations theory the practice turn in IR theory, which really focused on sort of practices and embodied dispositions. So the scholar who was a diplomat in the Norwegian Foreign Ministry named Ivar B. Newman is a scholar. You familiar with? Yeah. So Ivar B. Newman wrote an article, or actually 3 articles. One of them was called "The Body of the Diplomat," and the basic argument is that embodied practices themselves of being a diplomat, of diplomacy, exclude other forms of identity and imbue a diplomatic identity onto the body of the diplomat. And so you can look at this through gender, you can look at this through nationality, and religious practice. Many of these embodied dispositions, I think we talked about it last night, I think Peter mentioned it a little bit, but the dispositionality of being a diplomat may, in fact, exclude individual religious practice to such a degree that diplomats think instrumentally and are reinforced to not think constitutively or constructively about how religion forms ideas that they themselves are putting out into the world. And so they tend to think about this in terms of, like what Peter was talking about, like individual actions relevant for the decision maker, because that is the embodied disposition of what it means to live as a diplomat. And so how do you square that? Can diplomats actually do the work of translation? Or is there some impediment? Okay.
So for the cases, I'm still working on this, but I rely on the on the four criteria of religiously friendly autocratization, which is very highly, mostly, moderately, barely, or not friendly at all. But I'm trying to categorize them into only three categorization: friendly, or moderately, or not friendly. So I'm trying to combine the cases together. And in each case, I'm selecting, for instance, Turkey, Nicaragua, Philippines, Russia, and for instance, as a not friendly case that represents the not friendly categorization. But I'm still a skeptic about how I'm going to tackle case studies while I'm not doing field work. So I'm going to rely on what's available online, about news sources, about reports that are available online. So that's why I'm still whether they should be in different 3 chapters or there should be in 1 chapter because of the lack of original data or primary source or interviews that I'm not capable of doing right now. Because of the sensitivity of the topic, because of lots of things to take into consideration. So I'm still tackling whether it should be on 1 chapter or it is best to have 3 chapters on these different cases. So I'm selecting 2 cases in each of these categorization that I've done.
Yeah, thanks, John. Fascinating question. And I need to read this book. I think the diplomats in this room are going to be able to answer that much more accurately than I can. But taking a stab at it, I certainly think that idea of the body of the diplomat and the way that other forms of religious identity are excluded. I'm thinking yesterday as well, Scott talking about narrow frameworks that diplomats are kind of encouraged to work within. I think that explains a huge amount. So I think it does explain, as I said, the idea that the particular translation I think has been most popular, similarly what Peter was talking about. It's very much one of, well, this is just what we do, this is diplomacy. We work with people we disagree with all the time. This is just another actor in the same way that we would work with social groups and lots of other kind of non-state actors and so on. So it's not that different to what we're already doing. So I think it certainly shapes things. Can they kind of translate in a very different way? I think they can, and some people do. And I think it's also worth reflecting on the fact that there are staff religion networks within the FCDO, for instance, which is very much a case of people wanting to talk about how religion is a part of my identity that I shouldn't have to kind of leave at the door. There's people I've talked to who said, well, I was doing religious literacy training in the Foreign Office and I was there to talk about geopolitics, and people were there thinking, well, isn't this going to be more about HR and telling people not to kind of exclude me in the workplace? So I think there's a bit of internal diversity, but I definitely agree with the idea that it's part of the reason there are impediments and barriers, and it's something you have to navigate. Absolutely.
Jerry.
Let me connect your first question about strangeness, the importance of maintaining the strangeness, which Andrew pointed out. And then this point, and I'm not familiar with what your point, Joel, about what a diplomat's like. And I think the role of religion in peace processes is a great example. We've done a lot of work with the Catholic Church in places like Colombia, Philippines. We've done a lot of work in places like the Philippines, Colombia, Congo, South Sudan, with the Catholic Church. And in those cases, the church is playing a really important role, and Senior Fabio now is one of the key people in Colombia doing this. Very important role in peace processes, formal peace processes as well as informal peace processes. But as a Mennonite, John Paul Lederach, who's a real renowned peace studies scholar and whose work has been used by USAID, UNDP, and others, as pointed out, we tend to rely on the Mennonites to tell the Catholics what we got and what we don't got. But he said that he explains that it's and we've experienced this, that the people who are doing that peace process work do not see themselves as mediators. They don't see themselves as diplomats, even though the work that they're doing looks like mediation and looks like diplomatic work. Instead, they tend to see that they say, I'm just doing pastoral engagement. Letter Act says that you can't understand the role of the Senate video community, for example, which until recently was the official facilitator of the South Sudan peace process, if you don't understand the sacramental imagination of the Catholic Church that undergirds their work. And so that's where the strangeness is really important to maintain as diplomats try to translate. And that's where you can't just reduce everything to interest, or even the values that undergird British foreign policy. If you really want to translate, then you have to try to understand how the sacramental imagination might play a role in what Monsignor now is doing, and why that makes the church effective in that role.
Can I just add very quickly to that? Because I was chatting very similarly to a friend of mine who's been doing a lot of work on like a Muslim kind of peace-building organisation in Palestine, and we were talking about this idea of translation, and he was saying, well, I'm quite uncomfortable with it, because, well, why can't you just take it as it is? You know, if you translate it, are you actually going to dilute a lot of what makes this something really powerful and really effective at a local level? So there's huge amounts of kind of difficulties and nuance to think about here.
Yeah, I'm conscious in this question of translation that there's also a sense in which, when I think about what it was like to work on these issues at the State Department, and then some years later to work on them at USAID, that there's the extent to which the different missions of those agencies forced some of the translational work, insofar as, because USAID was mainly about moving money around in order to implement development programs, it meant that religious actors, faith-based organizations, could only be legible insofar as they possessed technical capacity to implement those programs. Whereas the State Department is an agency responsible for managing the entire repertoire of America's diplomatic relations, the whole question of what religious engagement meant and what religion was and what religious actors were was actually much more difficult and complicated to convey. So I want to open the conversation to the room, very conscious that we have in the room two of the theorists that Dina's work directly engages with, as well as a couple of people who have spent a fair amount of their careers in diplomatic or foreign policy implementation roles, who I think will be able to speak to some of the issues in Andrew's work. I think I saw Ibrahim's hand first. We'll maybe take a few questions and then turn back to the panel.
Thank you very much to all the panelists and Peter and the respondents. So let me start with Andrew and Peter. I'm wondering, Peter, whether that conversation between you and Chris Seipel is an either-or, and whether there is not a via media to have that conversation, because the idea of dealing with the technicalities and in order to get a policy directive through to the other side, the experience has been a colossal failure. I mean, Iraq shows it. This recent escapade in Iran and others have shown that we just don't understand. I mean, we invaded Iraq and we discovered Ayatollah Sistani, right? So I'm wondering whether there is a way in which you can deal with. So the specific question to Andrew is, you made a very good case about cultural Christianity, right? Who are going to be your interlocutors for cultural Islam, besides the Culmination Institute that is now shut down, right? So I was wondering whether you can direct us to a little bit of the patina of your conversation, of how you're thinking about structuring this translation, which I'm really sympathetic to. Some years ago, Talal Asad had an essay talking about the Salman Rushdie issue, right? And at the time when they were calls for Salman Rushdie's book to be banned by some people and the British government refused. Was it the book by was it Spycatcher? No, it was, Spycatcher, the candid autobiography of a senior intelligence officer, which revealed some secrets of MI5 and also the attempt to overthrow the Wilson government, etc. Mrs. Thatcher banned that book, right? And that was the case that many of the people in the Muslim community argued. I don't agree with banning books, of course, but they were making that argument, right? So how do you traverse that? Assad said that with Britain becoming more multicultural, multi-religious, etc., the framework of translation will have to experience some kind of shift to accommodate this cultural diversity that I think you are talking about. So give me a little bit of patina of how that conversation could be go. I like the conversation was at the theoretical level, but I'm seeking a little bit more specificity. Dina, thank you for your presentation. I mean, you also touched on, and you said your case studies is Turkey, Nicaragua, India. No, Turkey, India, and Hungary, right? No. What's? Yeah, that. Now, your slide very much spoke in kind of, very theoretical ways. I was wondering if you can give me a couple of examples, for instance, where you're going to look for this question of autocracies and what kind of moves they make. I need to hear a little bit of a story, and I hope that will make it clear for me. Thank you. I'm to draw you out on that. If you have the data, if you don't have, you can say you're still going to do it. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. I have a list of 4.5 names, half names just because I saw an arm go up and I wasn't sure if it was someone stretching or actually, no, I think it was you actually, so I think so why don't we do 2 more and then go back to the panel and then we can continue as time allows. So I think next, and then Scott.
Thank you. I'm Nikhil Menon. I'm an associate professor of history at Notre Dame. Thank you all for these very generative thoughts. My question is for Dina. It seemed to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but an assumption that comes through from what I gather of your presentation is that these autocratizers are religion agnostic, in that they don't have a sort of set ideology on their own, except for, I'm assuming, everlasting power, and that they operate within that sort of incentive structure. But is that always true? What of, for example, in the case of India, electoral authoritarians who do have ideologies that they have been swimming in since they were 9 years old, right? Or other, for example, in the case of Ziaul Haq in Pakistan, people that have very much their own ideologies. And the case of South Asia, especially Pakistan, seems to run against this idea of a temporally declining commitment to outreach towards religious institutions, because Ayub Khan, for example, a dictator in the late 50s and early 60s, comes into power and wants to modernize Pakistan, and the way he determines modernization is to be sort of secular and anti-clerical. Whereas Ziaul Haq comes in, and Ayub Khan actually becomes more religious later on when there's a sort of public backlash. Ziaul Haq is the opposite. He starts off extremely sort of devout. He is a very devout Muslim, but he interprets it in a very sort of in a certain direction, and sort of quote unquote moderates it later on. And so I'm wondering what role people's actual ideology. Or do we just assume that autocrats are human beings of a different sort who do not have the relationship, like, for example, perhaps diplomats, who do not have the same sort of embodied experience of religion. But in the case of some people, it seems as though that their religion is deeply held. And what do we do? How do we contend, or how do we make sense of that in your framework, is the question I had. And relatedly, it seems to me that just as in your framework, again, based on my many assumptions of having not read your entire manuscript, just as authoritarians or sort of autocrats seem to be religiously agnostic, it also seems that if we were to follow the logic of what you are suggesting, that religious authorities seem to be also democracy agnostic, in that these religious institutions do not seem to have any commitment to democracy. The commitment is only to having some sort of contact with power, and that when that fails, that is when they become supporters of democracy, because they are willing to sort of make an outreach to the autocrat in the initial phase as well. And so again, what do we say about the ideology of the religious institutions and of these autocrats? Thank you.
Thank you, Nikhil. And Scott, please.
This follows up on the question of embodiment and the body of the diplomat. And I'm going to put people on the spot here. Is Pasquale going already? Let's do that.
He ran.
Yeah, he had to go back to the European Academy. He would have been the perfect. I know Annabelle is hiding from me right now, so I might have to rely on her or some others in the diplomatic corps. Whoever is willing to address this.
Alex Rice.
Yes, there's Alex. The question is about diplomats and their formation as diplomats, and the question of formation. So I have met in my life many people who are deeply formed in one tradition or another. I have certain Jesuit friends, and they're not, I say, you're not Christian, you're not Catholic, you're Jesuit. And they are really, they are formed. And it's hard to get beyond that Jesuit formation to the individual, and I do because they're friends. But diplomats are also well formed in their craft. But I've known some diplomats, and as you get to know the person, privately, in my limited experience there is sometimes when they're engaging with religious actors or others, there's an official state policy. Their goal is to enforce what the policy of the government is. And there shouldn't be much distance between, typically there is not. On the other hand, diplomats are also engaging with a variety of people, and if they're good, they want to convey back those points of view, even for power relations, but they can be influenced personally by those relationships. So my question to anyone who can shed light upon this is that dynamic psychologically and professionally, when you as the ambassador, you as the diplomat, you as the mediator, think, wait a second, I really want to push back against some of these policies, and do I feel, under what authority do I bring some of the strangeness into a conversation when my superiors back in the home office are saying this is not what you're here for? Who wants to try that? Who want to do?
Annabelle, I'm relying on you to also say something. Hi, yes, Alex Rice. I'm happy to share a little bit. I'm obviously I've never a full diplomat, but working in USAID for 5 years, this is an interesting perspective, anyway, that I can offer. I also am focusing for my PhD and also for my master's in conflict mediation. And so a major component of it is the psychology of people in highly tense negotiation sessions, and understanding the physiological responses when you're in a high pressure situation, and why people will react or say things the way and come forward the way they do. I would say one of the most useful components is understanding before agreeing. It sounds very simple, but essentially it's the concept that if you are in a really difficult situation, starting with understanding the person before getting to agree with them is essential. So the example I often give from one of our colleagues, actually from USA, David Hunsaker, that gave me this great example of which was in an office, and the woman that was in the pediatrician's office was saying she wasn't sure if she wanted to get her kids vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccine. And he asked questions. He said, well, why? What's your concern? What are you thinking? What do you mean? And essentially was able to get to the root of her concern, which was, I'm really scared for my children. I don't know what this is. I've heard a lot of conflicting information. I simply want to make sure that my child is safe. And instead of coming to it from the perspective of you're anti-science, you're anti-vaccine, instead it was, oh, you're scared for your children, which every parent, I'm sure, can understand. And so in these kinds of scenarios, when it's representing something like the U.S. government, and as you say, having to stick to a party line or a policy, being able to go back to the office or the administration itself and saying, listen, I need you to understand the other side. But it's not so, I'm not coming to you saying you're wrong, I'm coming to you saying we're not understanding the way this is being interpreted in other contexts. And until we have a good understanding of that, it's going to be really difficult for us to do our work well. Now, that's very idealistic and very high-minded, because I think what we are talking about a lot is that this is not something this is not a template that can be copy-pasted around the world. Every context is going to be unique, and so it's very difficult for diplomats and people representing governments to go back and say, we need a unique situation in every single context and make that stick. But I think that is the first step that we can recognize and acknowledge, and maybe bring back that message of this can't be something we can do everywhere. This has to be understood in the specific context in which we work.
Thank you so much for your questions regarding examples, illustrative examples. I just left it for your own imagination, because if I told you about examples, you don't have to buy the book. So, yeah, I can give you a spicy intro that I put in at the beginning of chapter 3, where the Nicaraguan bishops did not surrender but opposed, despite their institutional life having been strategically stripped. The same Daniel Ortega, who was imprisoning bishops and expelling nuns, had only a decade earlier criminalized abortion at the church's request, extended generous policy concessions to Catholic institutions, and refined the relationship with the very hierarchy he was now destroying. So the church had been friendly enough to support, or at least tolerate, and then hostile enough to oppose. The strategy changed, the response changed. So I hope this will like a glimpse of Nicaraguan case that tells you how the process of autocratization duration also affects how the autocratizer deals with the religious institutions, and how religious institutions are dealing with autocratizers. Regarding the ideology thing, whether it is always true, we don't know the intentions of the autocratizers. But I'm also including the religious narrative, the religious texts that are used in the speeches of whether this is a true based on ideological background, or it is just to seduce the religious institutions or not. So I'm not neglecting this part, but whether we are going to say it is an ideology or not, this might be debatable. So also regarding the cases that you mentioned about Pakistan, I found like it is in 2017 and in from 2017 to 2018, and Pakistan 2015 and 2016. So these are the periods of autocratization that I'm taking here. So this is a very short period. We are talking about 2015 to 2016 autocratizing period. That doesn't mean the autocratizer hadn't enough time to actually do anything strategic. So this might also answer the question of why it is not fitting the cases or fitting the general results that I found. Also about religious institutions, you said also about their own ideology and about democracy. Well, that's what I'm trying to do right now in the book, and extend the argument about religious dominant institutions and religious minorities. So, do they really care about democracy or about their own survival? And as I said in my own presentation, the strategy of autocratizer backfires, religious institutions oppose those who have strong historical pro-democratic role and other indicators as well. But if you are talking about democracy here, yes, they are still fighting against authoritarianism. But when it comes to religious minorities, and this is what I found in my new results, is that historical pro-democratizing role fades away. That's because they really care more about their own survival than about democracy issue here. So which religious institution that really stick to their own stances, really care about democracy, really care about their own positions, really care about their own population and their own followers, determines what institutions we are talking about. Dominant institution, so they will care about democracy because they have many followers that they are afraid to lose them. But minority institutions, they are actually afraid. There are lots of threats, so they care more about survival than about anything else. But that doesn't mean that religious institutions does not have also strong historical pro-democratizing role. You can find exceptions about it, but this is just the general finding that I found as well. So this kind of, whether they are acting on behalf of their own ideological thing or not, depends on the case, and also depends on the real intentions that we cannot determine whether this is true or not.
I'll say a couple of things. I mean, just on kind of Annabelle's comments, I kind of agree with pretty much everything Annabelle said, and I think, as Jerry mentioned in his kind of comments, I think it's the British Embassy's work that I usually bring up as an example of there's something a bit interesting going on here and a bit different. I think, turning to Ibrahim Musa's question, I think, war on terror, CDE, it's something I bring up in this book as really pretty much a kind of a cautionary tale. So not, bringing up the Quilliam Foundation and, this is an example of what should be taking place. But, as Assad says, I think we're talking about the same article, the idea that when you go back to the Rushdie affair, Muslims have been treated as essentially illegitimate to defining British culture due to the legacy of colonialism, amongst other things. So, in terms of when I kind of talk to interviewees and interlocutors, there's absolutely a recognition that cultural Christianity is, in this context, actually very, very exclusionary. Maybe not necessarily, I think it depends on how you talk about it. I don't want to suggest that, people within the Anglican Church and Tommy Robinson are doing very different things, but in any case, in terms of what's dominant in the UK and I think other countries at this point, it's absolutely something that's premised as a rejection of Muslims. And so, the people I talk to will say, well, I want to talk about, the huge contribution that Islam and Muslims have had to the UK. And I struggle to do that because I'm just expected to talk about terrorism and extremism, so I don't get that space. So again, it's where I bring up all of these power dynamics and questions of epistemic violence, questions of whose translation is enabled, who's invited into that process, because I think you could say, well, in terms of cultural Islam in the UK, in some ways that's a translation that's not really been allowed to happen. And, Peter of mine, a very good friend who has been trying to do some of that work and talk about contextualising Islam to the UK and, what a British Islam might mean, but on our own terms. And then gets pushback from the opposite direction as well, from people saying, well, you're a puppet, you're just telling us what the government wants you to do. You're just integrating us here, but then without letting us kind of push back and make real political change. So it's a really, really fraught, politically toxic space, really. That's maybe not a satisfactory answer, but it's giving you the patina, at least.
What do you think of Peter Oborn's work?
I'm less familiar with it, but I'd be really interested to talk to you about it afterwards. Yeah.
So I've got three names on the list: Michael, Mary, and our colleague Simon. So let's take those three questions and go back to the panel. I suspect that'll probably do it for us time-wise, but we can see how the clock goes. So, Mike.
No, thanks so much, and so great to see both of your work. And we have Summer's folks in the room, and so great to see how that brings forward into book projects. So I'm just so grateful to read both of you. I just want to engage with Dina just slightly on two notes. One is just to, I think, bring something forward that you have there, and that is, how much of your work is showing the unexpected consequences of state institutionalization of religion, which I think is great and so important. And I think it challenges two narratives that we see within the field. One is, in some ways, the critical vision of religion, the sort of critical studies of religion, that even some of what we were seeing with the last panel is that the state is not the only religious actor, and it's not always the hegemon. So when the state institutionalizes religion, sometimes it doesn't get what it wants, and that's an interesting insight. But it also, I think, challenges the religious economy's literature, which tends to see the bureaucratization of religion as hollowing out religion. But instead, here you find that actually resources are offered to religious actors who can take them in different ways, including by re-challenging the state as well. So some of the hidden liberatory logic, which may sometimes be that religious actors can use, but also institutional logic where they can further their national interests. So I would just note how religiously friendly democracy or autocracy oftentimes offers resources to religious leaders in ways that we don't usually expect, given the major literatures that we have on religion and politics today. So that was a comment and would love for a response. And then the other is more of a question, which is about about this central finding of yours about the appointment of religious leaders. So, you find very clearly that religious institutions which are able to appoint their own bishops have a lot more power vis-a-vis the state. And I wonder if that's a category versus a scale of religiously friendliness. And we've engaged a little bit about this before, but for some religious traditions like Catholicism, that is a mark of religious friendliness. To be able to appoint your own bishops, that's the preference of the Catholic Church. But it's not the preference of established religious churches. It's not the preference of oftentimes Islam within the state, where they're happy to have the state actually appoint their own clerics. So I just think I wonder if it's useful to distinguish when and where that is that the appointment of clerics is a mark of religious favoritism, or where it's just whether or not it's a preference or not a preference. Because in the case of Islam and national churches, it's not necessarily religiously favoritism. It's just what they desire is something different. So
great, thanks, Michael. If you could hand the microphone up to Mary. Thank you, Mohammed.
I need the steps.
Thank you so much to our panelists again, absolutely first class discussion. I want to address questions both to Dina and to Andrew. I think the question that I want to put really is interrelated. If I was to put any two words in quotation marks that have raised their heads here, funny enough it wouldn't be religion, sorry Aaron, it would be secular and neutral. And the question I want to put to you is, many of the autocracies that you mentioned, Dina, are overtly confessional states. In our world, that is a fundamental reality, but at least they are overt in that respect. Many of our democracies self-ideate as neutral and as secular, but they are in fact covertly confessional. And I just take the United Kingdom as probably a good example, having been born and raised there. I would ask the question about the overt confessionalism of those states which self-ideate as liberal democracies. And I'm just going to take the example of the United Kingdom. Within the United Kingdom, you have England, which is actually overtly confessional, except that most people don't know that. It's not something that diplomats will talk about. Unless they come to Ireland, be warned, when you will be told time and again that you are confessional. You will also be told time and again, you are not post-imperial, you are not post-colonial yet. You have a little bit to go yet in terms of post-colonialism. I don't know how you feel about that, Andrew, particularly when you're travelling on an Irish passport. But there's a little bit of work yet to go in dismantling old colonial Britain. Now, the problem with that is and I'll take a parallel of the Catholic Church, because one of the criticisms I have of the Church is, which is overtly confessional, fine, at the Holy See, can present itself to the world through its diplomatic corps and through its hierarchy as a body that is in favour of human rights, is progressively pushing human rights, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. And that's fine when it talks from the moral pulpit out to the global community. Ask it to take the spotlight and turn it inwards, internally, and you get a wholly other different answer. Because there you find that within the Catholic Church, human rights, particularly in its Code of Canon Law in relation to its members, its human rights are constricted, restricted, issues to do with not just gender equality, but right across the whole membership, the compulsory obedience, passivity in relation to things like, for example, freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, freedom of conscience. So the parallel I'm drawing there is with, and it gets back to your point really, Scott, is the formation of whether our national diplomats, whether it's British diplomats, whether it's diplomats from the Holy See, that in their formation, they are essentially defenders of their own nation or jurisdiction self-ideation. And we have found this time and time again, particularly those of us from Northern Ireland who had to live through years of British self-ideation as so-called neutrals while sending in an army that did something like, for example, Bloody Sunday, or Glenanne, or Ballymurphy, killing Catholics, simply innocent Catholics. In a long line, incidentally, that goes right back to our friends that we talked about earlier this morning, the Andrew McKinleys of this world and the Theodore Roosevelts, while they were busy talking to Catholics, the Catholic Church in the Philippines, their cousins were busy killing Catholics and pilgrims in right across Ireland, but in particular in Northern Ireland, Ulster, Scots. So, what I'm saying really is there is an opportunity in formation and self-ideation to conceal truths, to absolutely other the others, whether it's the autocracy, to see them as hermetically sealed in a way that we, the liberal Democrats, are not. We are open, we're embracing. Are we? Are we really? And that's the question I'd like to pose.
Great. Thank you very much. And Mahan, some great steps for you all the way to the back of the room and sign up.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this panel and event. I learned so much. I have a question about autocrats. Many people in my country, I think in Western Europe, maybe the West in general, often say, well, the autocrats don't believe it themselves. They just instrumentalize religion. What would be your response? That's my first question to Dina. I also would like to share a little bit about the soul searching and how to train diplomats in religious literacy. I've been privileged to train young diplomats now for 5 years in the Netherlands. I have to say that might be a reason that's different than in other countries. And what I often see is what works to do some of this soul searching is, first of all, talk about biographies. How has religion, spirituality shaped your life? So I often do a storytelling after the training, and then I ask them to share a story about their professional or personal life, and they all share stories about their personal lives, how they encountered religion, how they liked it or didn't like it, etc., and how it shaped them. The second way is that I, at a certain point in my lecture, say we all have a worldview. And worldviews really shape the way you act in the world, and it even can have a big influence if you have power too. And there's also some discussion: do we all have a worldview? But at a certain point, they accept, yes, I have a worldview too, and maybe there's something in my worldview that's biased towards religion. And then the final one is when we come to the point: you are a professional, and if you want to have a robust professional identity, that means that you have to integrate your professional self with your personal self. And your personal self also includes the values that you find important. So that really helps, at least in the context of the Netherlands, to address religion. It might be different in the Netherlands, I have to say, because what I really see is that since about 10 years, there are no people, especially the young, that are allergic to religion, because they've grown up without religion. So they're just curious, and if we have this storyteller session, they're just looking and they want to know more about religion. So that's something I just wanted to share. Thank you.
No, thanks very much, Simon. I want to go ahead and now invite our panelists to respond to that last set of questions.
Well, where do I begin with Mary's fantastic contribution? I agree with all of that. I think there's plenty to go with dismantling British imperialism, not just because I don't want you to take my Irish passport away, but because that's what you grow up learning in the UK as well, at least in Jesuit schools. I absolutely agree that we should be putting the secular and the neutral in quotation marks. I tried to do that with a kind of ironic tone of voice rather than doing this all the time, which maybe didn't carry, but absolutely. Are liberal Democrats hermetically open in a way that religious communities somehow aren't? Well, no, absolutely not. Completely not. I think when we turn to the question of the overt confessionalism of liberal states, I'll just talk about that in the context of Anglican church establishment in England, because that's the one that I have the most familiarity with. And I think absolutely you have a set of privileges for the Anglican Church that do not extend to other religious communities. And for a lot of people, it's a huge source of frustration. I think what I'm going to say that's probably going to sound a bit counterintuitive is that it is not as big a source of frustration as you would expect for other religious communities. And Tarek Madood has a very interesting article from, I think it's about 20 years ago, it still gets quoted all the time, basically saying, look, I don't know anyone from a minoritised religious community in Britain who is actually that concerned about church establishment, because we have bigger problems. Actually, the problems that we have is from a state that thinks that it's secular, that thinks that it's neutral, but is incredibly exclusionary. And we look at the Anglican Church and we see something that's actually relatively powerless. I think some people would now go further and say, we actually see in the Church of England something that's helping facilitate a certain amount of religious public participation for other religious communities. Now, you can view that very, very cynically, and a lot of people do, and talk about, you're just trying to justify your privileges because otherwise, church establishment is over because there's barely any Anglicans left anyway. I get that view, but there's a lot of other people who say, well, no, it means that there is actually an organisation within the establishment that gets into these rooms that does actually have an awareness of the concerns that other religious communities face. And there's a lot of trade-offs and tensions there. But it's a complicated area, and that's, you do see cases of, coordinated pushback against things like widening definitions of extremism, which were not going to be directly focused on the Church of England, but where the Church of England was really front and centre in rejecting that and saying, this is absolutely unacceptable. So there's lots of interesting tensions and nuances as we'd expect. Look at that.
So thank you all for the comments and questions. I'm not sure, Jason, that I got your question correctly or not, but if you are asking about how much the unexpected outcomes is actually telling us about the state institutionalization, but it tells us that autocratizers might be stupid, right? This is at one point, and I hope that they are not going to read my own books, so not to learn from about how much is their own strategies are not working well at the end. So I'm not sure if this is the answer to your question. The second one is about the appointment of religious leaders, and it is not considered as a friendly policy, but it reinforced the friendly policy. And here, what actually my own result is telling, that so I'm not considering it as a friendly policy itself, but as a mechanism that reinforces to achieve a religious friendly. And as you can see in the third chapter about the religious institutional response, and I controlled it and put it as a different variable outside the religiously friendly. Regarding also the question that's similar to the question about ideology, what about autocratic states that they are confessional? You know, we don't know. Maybe they are liars. Maybe they are truly ideological, but we don't know how we are going to know about such a thing. But this is actually might be one of the positive things of quantitative study, is to let's see these people with the other. And this tells us this is a strategy. It's not only about ideology. And you can see Trump, for instance. We are in Rome, right? So I can say Trump here. So, Trump, yeah.
It shall not be mentioned.
So how we, whether they are true believers, so this is a true ideology, as I said before, we don't know about this, but let's see this in other states as well. So, and see the duration of autocratization, and see 133 autocratizers years I'm dealing with. There is a pattern here. So is it really about ideology? Maybe this is a philosophical question, a quantitative scholar is not going to answer, but I'm leaving it to other scholars to think about it. So this might be also in my own conclusion. Let's talk about this philosophically, let's talk about this in a more broader and deeper way. Thank you so much.
I'm going to restate that, probably not in as eloquent of a way as Dina, but I do want to tie that answer back to what I was talking about with diplomacy in my question to Andrew. Perhaps autocracy, this strings together multiple questions about whether autocrats believe what they're selling. Perhaps autocracy or diplomacy is not something that is thought about. It is rather thought from. It is a series of dispositions and thinkings and preferences and tastes that are constructed through the structure in which the agent finds themselves. Now this is, last night we talked about Derrida, and so this is Bourdieu's pushback against Derrida and language, that belief is secondary for us observing it. Belief is secondary to action and practice. That autocrats or diplomats may or may not believe is somewhat secondary to what is observable. And that is really well done, and I think what Dina presents, and that is mechanisms of friendliness or repression relative to capacity over time is the empirical question. And the empirics show that there is indeed trends across the world in this regard. And so what is clever about what Dina presents is that we can essentially bracket the belief question and look at observations of practice and of what they actually do. And so as a political scientist, I'm very comfortable with that. But I think it does advance this debate in a really productive way.
Jerry, any last thoughts before we...
Okay, great. So I'm not even going to try to synthesize or summarize this incredibly rich conversation we had, not least of all because I'm conscious that I'm now the obstacle between you and lunch. We've had plenty of food for thought. We need food for body as well. So we'll move to lunch now, and then we'll resume at 2:45 for the third session on religious networks, identity politics, and religio-political theory, chaired by Gerard. So let me just ask you to join me in thanking our four panelists.